This is an interdisciplinary group of academics and graduate students in data science, economics, medicine, neuroscience, nursing, various social sciences and social work, working to help reduce the frequency and intensity of homelessness in our region and beyond. And John Corbett, who's one of our important members, is a human geographer who is also leading a parallel institute. We're sort of overlapping Venn diagrams, the Institute for Community Engaged Research, also at UBC, and John will be elaborating some of his work and the work of the Institute later on in today's presentation, all in relation to homelessness. So over to the next slide. So you can see more or less this is the time allotment, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. We're very interested in dialogue and getting people's insights, getting people's questions, people's thoughts, and really engaging in a conversation about some of the solution-based talking we can be doing about homelessness. And we have many experts in tonight's group who are presenting, including Michael Shapcott. I wanted to recognize, and Michael and I go back many years when he was executive director of the Wellesley Institute, working directly in the homelessness area. And Father Marcus Germain is among many other things that he's done in his life, he's a very experienced social worker who knows a great deal too. And there's so many other people beyond these two who have real expertise. And so it'll be very, very fine conversation. Next slide, please, Kyler. And so I've described the KHRC briefly, and what we're doing is we're highlighting some of the work that's going on within KHRC, but I really do invite you to check out the website. If you just Google Kelowna Homelessness Research Collaborative, up pops our website, there it is. And we've got various links identifying various research projects that we've completed that are in progress, various resources for preventing homelessness in our region beyond, various news items, a research blog that Kyler Woodmass within our group leads, among other aspects. It's really quite a powerful resource. Next slide, please, Kyler. Now, homelessness itself is a terrible problem, and it's a wicked problem, as they say in the social sciences. Seemingly a simple thing, not enough housing for people who are vulnerable, and yet so complex because it's involving so many intersecting factors and auspices, personnel, and political factors, among other things. It's a real problem. The 2021 Stats Canada survey indicates upwards of 235,000 people in Canada experience homelessness in any given year, and a typical night across the country. The appalling reality is 25 to 35,000 people will be experiencing homelessness. Tyler's got some point in time data on a subsequent slide that provides specific data on Vernon. A 2020 point in time count in Kelowna indicated that there were 297 homeless people, and a fairly recent study conducted by the Homelessness Hub and centered in Toronto indicates that the annual cost of homelessness in Canada, when you factor in lost wages and aggregate costs of services and supports, to be around $7 billion. So this is a tremendous amount of money. Probably one of the most useful ways of understanding homelessness is a concept coined by late great sociologist C. Wright Mills in the early 1960s. It's a nexus of two mutually intersecting phenomena: private troubles and public issues. And so an individual experience homelessness, it could be precipitated by any number of factors, including, in no particular order, an abrupt end to a relationship, an abrupt onset of psychosis, discharge from prison, fleeing family violence, losing a job, having a car repossessed, getting evicted. Now, these are experienced on an individual level, but they intersect with broader public issues that make homelessness even more of an intractable problem and increase the probability of an individual being homeless in the first place. And these include, in no particular order again, low rates of available rental housing stock, poor access to timely substance misuse treatment, insufficient resources to help people transition from income security program to employment, including earnings disregards, insufficient community supports for complex needs individuals. For example, an individual having one or more of the following: a traumatic brain injury, a mental health issue, a substance misuse disorder, trauma, developmental delay, etc. Social welfare and health services retrenchment generally are a tremendous problem for all vulnerable peoples in our community, including and perhaps especially the homeless. And we're seeing in our communities and beyond underfunded services, high staff turnover for those serving the communities most vulnerable, partly due to the fact that many jobs in the homelessness sector and in like sectors aren't highly remunerated. So homelessness is a real problem. And we're here today to nonetheless talk about various encouraging developments within our community. And one of the take-home points that we're hoping to leave everybody with is that we can be part of the solution and that there is hope. So those two things, we're all part of the solution, and there is in fact a great deal of hope and promise. Now I'm going to provide a summary sketch of an in-progress project that's involving faith groups in the city of Kelowna. And it's a neighbor-to-neighbor model of relationships. It's a pilot that's going to be starting in March of 2022, involving 3 groups of lay people, of 2 to 4 in number, within the United Church, likely within Metro Church. They seem to be interested, involved, and likely within the Anglican Cathedral, who will be in turn paired with an individual. Each pod of faith group people will be paired with an individual, respectively, who have transitioned from homelessness to housed. And those individuals would like to receive ongoing informal social support and neighbor-to-neighbor relationships. So this goes beyond the usual cadre of professional services to speak to the very real needs of social contacts, social support that can be provided informally by concerned members of the community who became acquaintances and friends with the people who were involved in the project. We're going to be monitoring this particular pilot. We're going to be bringing in graduate students, likely under my supervision, doing bi-weekly process evaluations and outcome evaluations on this particular project. And we're extremely interested in developing and sustaining neighbor-to-neighbor relationships. That's one of 7 objectives of the project. Another one is to use these relationships as leverage for further community engagement with individuals, and to therefore expand the networks of association that could provide even further social support and even stronger social ties with the individual who's transitioning from homeless to housed. Using these same relationships as leverage for further community engagement with other people. And so it's a way of sharing what's going on in the homelessness sector in a very proactive, goal-oriented, and positive way. We're terribly interested in keeping individuals who are transitioning from homeless to housed, and that's an absolute objective of this study. Providing tangible social supports to the participants in the pilot, disseminating various experiences of this pilot to mainstream and social media platforms in order to help influence the narrative, which can be quite frequently, you see this in social media and mainstream media, a discourse of fear, discourse of alienation, discourse of pessimism, rather than a discourse of hope and promise, and all of us rolling up our sleeves, working together in genuine community. And finally, we're going to be seeing if this particular pilot has legs, whether or not there's an appetite for scaling it up beyond the few people that are being involved in the pilot. So that, in summary, is a project that seems to have legs within the faith community in Kelowna right now, and I'm confident enough in it to be talking about it in its early genesis stages, but we have enough people in it who are committing to it that I can confidently assert today in January that I fully anticipate by March the project will be going. So on to the next presenter. And we'll be able to follow up on Q&A and elaborate some of these things and other related issues later on. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think I'm up next. Kyler, would you mind throwing up my 2 slides for everyone? And while we're waiting for that, it's so nice to see so many members and folks joining us. I see some names from my field education days for our School of Social Work, and really excited to see all these fresh faces to me. So thank you all for joining us today. Okay, so my name is Stephanie Lang. I am the Director of Operations for the KHRC, as well as a PhD student at the University of Calgary. Now, I'll be speaking a bit about some specifics when it comes to KHRC and our work to really set the stage to dive into Bethany's great work and Dr. Corbett's great work in Vernon, and to wrap us up with a video before we go into Q&A. So over the past year, the KHRC has begun or completed numerous different research projects, including, for example, the faith and homelessness work that John was just discussing, examining organizations' responses to plans to end homelessness, particularly in 3 cities. We're looking at the impact of COVID-19 on youth homelessness and service provision. We've completed a review to understand how technological innovations really support people who are experiencing homelessness. And we've done some significant work exploring allyship and research. However, to situate where the KHRC is currently and where we're headed as part of our mission, I'm going to bring us all back briefly to some of the first work that we completed in 2019. And so this was titled Addressing Homelessness in Kelowna, Establishing Participatory Action Research Priorities. And this was aptly named because we needed to hear from those that were experiencing homelessness in our community in order to work together to establish these research priorities for the KHRC. So this particular project was led by Carrie Rempel, Dr. Kylie Myra, and myself as researchers from the KHRC, and we came from that more traditional academic and applied kind of research background. But we also worked with our co-researchers with lived experience of homelessness. And over 2 different phases of research, we convened a series of focus groups and validation groups that asked individuals with lived experience and professionals that were working in the sector to describe what factors most contributed to being homeless and what solutions could mitigate or prevent those vulnerabilities. Now, the intent was really to gather place-specific feedback relative to the Kelowna community. And a further focus group took place online, as at that point we were engaging virtually, as we are now during COVID-19, and that was utilized to identify further research possibilities that were aimed at increasing the effectiveness of community-based prevention interventions for at-risk individuals. Kyler, if you can move to the next slide. Now, what we found during that first set of focus groups around those factors that most contributed to being vulnerable to homelessness was that 2 key factors really paired together to create vulnerability. So that was risk and critical incidents. Now, risk factors that could contribute to vulnerability could be, for example, poverty, age, housing, some of the stuff that Dr. Graham was talking about a little bit earlier that's been found in previous research too. Whereas critical incidents were those things that happened at particular points in time that had a really significant impact on someone's life. So those could be things that happened multiple times. They could be one single critical incident, but often participants did describe that it was possible to manage a single critical incident or perhaps 1 or 2. But when multiple critical incidents, so things like medical issues, loss of employment, occurred in a short period of time, often those effects were so overwhelming that individuals did not have the resources to cope. So throughout the focus groups, we explored further with participants those vulnerabilities, and in doing so, 3 other key factors emerged. First are the individual factors, and participants described barriers to accessing services, lack of availability of services as it related to them as an individual. And so these could be things like a lack of trust, inadequate supports, lack of trust in the system itself. Now, next up, we can see on the slide 2 under vulnerabilities are those factors that are related to the sector or the homelessness serving system. And those were impacting the ability for individuals to either receive or to continue receiving services that are designed to help them remain housed. And this could be things like stigma in healthcare, siloing or disconnectedness, so that lack of communication and cohesion across different systems and different sectors that were servicing individuals. Finally, there were societal factors that also played a role in creating barriers or challenges, and these are factors that relate directly to the community in the Kelowna area. And they consisted of things like isolation, there were a lack of mentors in the community, there's poor community planning, the effects of NIMBYism, so not in my backyard. So, confronted with the combination of risk and critical incidents leading to that vulnerabilities that we have there, we've then further examined vulnerability through individual factors, system and sector, and then societal to turn to the next phase to understand and lessen those risks. So that vulnerability to homelessness, and identify where in this downward spiral that you can see on the screen of those critical incidents, identify where in that spiral into homelessness it could have been halted. And that way we could move to solutions and interventions that were coming from those experiencing homelessness, as well as service providers. So what participants identified were that there were 3 distinct points where intervention could have changed that outcome for an individual on that critical incident spiral. So in prevention, those were things like supports or services that addressed an underlying risk or helped to deal with one or more critical incidents. At system entry, that was the point where individuals first entered into the homeless serving system. So they may have either been identified as experiencing significant risk of losing their housing, or they're experiencing their first encounter of homelessness. And third, during or following services. So these are points in time where individuals are actively receiving supports, or when they're moving into more independent situations or perhaps exiting the system. So I mentioned earlier those individual level and factors, the system and sector factors, and social or community factors. And there are interventions at each of those levels at the point of prevention, at the point of system entry, and at the point of during and after services that could lessen the risk for first-time homelessness, or could interrupt that spiral of homelessness and could change the outcome for individuals. So we have a very detailed community report, homelessness vulnerabilities and potential mitigating supports reports, it's a mouthful, that identifies those specific suggestions of those very interventions. And you can find that on our website under the KHRC Community Reports and Summaries tab. So I'm going to leave it here for now on this particular project, but I hope that this has been helpful in highlighting and kind of framing tonight's presentation when we think about experiences of and vulnerabilities to homelessness, particularly as we discuss some of the work taking place in Vernon with Dr. Corbett and Bethany, and again with our video later on creating allyship and research, as that particular group took place with the same group of researchers under the KHRC, and it was born directly from the work and project that I just described. So Dr. Corbett, I will hand it over to you now. Thank you, everyone.
John, you're on mute.
That means I owe you all a beer, eh? Super nice to be here. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for the pass off. Thank you for reminding me that I'm muted. It happens all the time, even after 2 years, eh? John, thank you as well for bringing us all together, working on this important issue. And Chris, thanks for arranging for this evening. Also, thank you to all the attendees. I see that there's 68 of you. I recognize a number of the names in the list. It's really nice that you're here and that you can actually join us this evening. I am going to share my screen really quickly. And for some reason, I was having a little bit of an issue earlier about sharing the entire screen. So this is going to be slightly complicated because I'm actually going to try and do a whole bunch of different things involving sharing not just this one PowerPoint presentation, but sharing a whole bunch of stuff. So first of all, the things I want to talk about this evening really are a sort of collaboration between KHRC, which is really, John's incredible sort of, like research child, and the Institute for Community Engaged Research. So I'm the director of the Institute. The Institute's been around for about 5 or 6 years. I'm going to talk very briefly about that first, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of initiatives that we've worked on specifically over the last 18 months, working on the issue of homelessness. And also in collaboration primarily with the with a number of organizations in Vernon, but I will get onto that in a moment. So the Institute was formed about 6 years ago, and essentially it's a combination of about 40 different faculty members in the university who in turn manage about 80 different graduate students. We collaborate with another, I think, 50 different community organizations up and down the valley, really from the very south up to here in Vernon. We work on a number of different issues which are deemed to be significant within the community. I mean, I think one of the issues about research is, we've all heard these expressions before, counting the angels on the head of a pin. But I mean, I think ultimately what those sorts of comments are noting is that research can be incredibly self-serving. But I think what we attempt to do, both through KHRC's work, but also ISA's work, is that we try to engage in research which is of significance to the community. And that means us actually taking direction directly from the community in order to actually engage in research, which is important for our organizational collaborators. So I'm going to talk us through a couple of different projects that we've been working on this issue of homelessness. And I'd just like to say this is just one sort of small part of our portfolio. And the first is a project that was working with the Social Planning Council of North Okanagan with Annette, who I see you're here. Oh my God, I knew I was going to get that wrong. Which was a project which was actually done in a class. We had 10 students, 3 of them were graduate students, so they were doing their master's degrees, and I think there was 1 PhD student, and then 7 of them were undergraduate students. And Annette tasked us with the fact that, well, in Vernon, one of the main issues is that we have a disproportionately high per capita homelessness rate, but at the same time, it's extremely hard for a small to medium-sized city in Canada to access the funds that it needs to do to seriously to come to grips with this issue of homelessness. So what other sort of leading exemplars are there of small-sized cities around the world in a similar situation, and how have they addressed this issue of homelessness? And this was basically the problem statement that we gave these 10 students, and they set off and they basically researched approaches to homelessness around the world, looking at projects that were low cost, that were effective, in other words, they had elements of success behind them, and ultimately that were actionable by the city of Vernon. They came back with 15 different projects. They presented them to one of the action committees related to homelessness. And I think it was well received. The report is actually available through the KHRC website. But I think it's a really neat example of where students can actually be brought in to directly do a body of research which addresses, an identified community need. So one of the things that came out of this was this project which had taken place in Australia called Ask Izzy. So Ask Izzy is basically a web-based app that can be used by homeless people, but also by service providers as a way of actually documenting the services that are actually available. And so with actually funding from John, we set out, and also with guidance from Annette, we set out to actually develop a sort of localized Ask Izzy type tool in Vernon. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually talk you through a little bit about what we've actually achieved, because I've been working on this for the last 6 months now. And this is going to be great for Annette, because it's kind of like, this is the report that I probably should have given you about 3 or 4 weeks ago. But anyway, here it is right now. The tool's divided up into a couple of parts. So I am going to stop sharing this screen, I think, and I am going to share now my web browser, which is this one. And you can see that this is essentially what the interface looks like. So if you're working in bylaw, or you have basically a set of permissions, you've got all of the different information which is currently available on the Vernon Survival Guide. But what we've done is we put it into a digital format. So you see we've got health services, we've got Indigenous community supports, we've got housing, it goes on and on and on. But what we try to do is to design an interface which is absolutely as straightforward as possible, but also as like low bandwidth as possible, because we recognize as well that particularly if you're paying for your data usage, you don't want to be downloading tons of stuff that you don't need. So basically, any particular like administrative user can come in, they can simply add a new item to each one of these different categories if you want. We'll call this whatever, a new health service. We can add information about telephone numbers, websites, email addresses, contact people, whatever it might want. We submit it and give it a second or two. Bam, it then hopefully appears, here we go, on our website. And so this is how easy it is for people to be able to update the sort of fundamental services that homeless people might need to be able to access the services they need at any given time. And that's fine, but we also recognize that, you know, for many people who are unhoused, they don't have access to computers unless they go into the library. Many of them are working with cell phones, but cell phones in turn, you know, there's a high data bandwidth costs associated with that. So what we did was we actually took this information and then we created a small app that can be used on your phone. So now I'm going to go out again and I'm going to share my screen. I'm getting quite good at this now, despite the fact that I was muted to start with. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my phone here. This is actually my phone. Can you all see it? You can see my vaccination status. Okay. All right, let me open this up, close that down so you don't see my email. Can everybody see this okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, brilliant. All right, so now what I'm going to do, you can see down here, I've got this little thing, the Vernon Survival Guide, nice icon. You click on that and it opens this up and it's got exactly the same information that we added through the simple web interface. So you can imagine this is a really easy way in order to basically digitize the Vernon Survival Guide, but also to develop it so that it's actually instantaneously updatable. As new services come online, as new staff members come into play, essentially it's as simple as getting in and editing a Word document. In fact, to be honest, it's like even easier than that because the entire system is so tightly structured, it's extremely low overhead. So it's easy for people to download and to use it. Like here, I think there's less than 1 megabyte of data transfer within this. So you can see as a structure, like this has been a really neat opportunity because, here we go, I'm going to stop this one now. I'm going to share back the other one, a bit like a dancer right now, aren't I? So we're going to go and share this one. So you can see that we started with this term project with a whole bunch of students. We developed a really neat relationship with the Social Planning Council of North Okanagan. And then from that, then we started to explore the possibilities about some of these projects that we could actually bring into being together as a collaboration. Essentially, we have now started to bring this actually into a reality. And I hope in turn that it will have some sort of application and use in the future. I think also another really important point for us, certainly working in ISA, is the fact that there's an awful lot of incredibly innovative, groundbreaking initiatives already underway in Vernon, considering that it is a small city, considering it does have limited access to funds. There's a lot of really neat work actually underway. And so for us to be able to partner with a number of organizations within the city, I think hopefully that it's of benefit to those organizations, but also I think it means you know, it makes the university itself much more relevant within, you know, within the valley and more broadly than that. So another partnership we're going to talk about really briefly, I'm going to pass over to Beth, who's actually going to talk about her research again, and she has been working also with the Social Planning Council of the North Okanagan. So without further ado, I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to pass over to you, Beth.
Thanks, John, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'll just share my screen here. Sorry. Okay, perfect. So yeah, thank you for inviting me today. My name is Bethany, and I'm completing my master's in the Community Engagement, Social Change and Equity program at UBC, and I'm also a member of the KHRC. So my co-supervisors are actually here today, John Corbett and John Graham. But today I'll be highlighting the projects sort of the research and projects on homelessness in Vernon and the initiatives in place in the community to help and address and reduce the issue of homelessness. So I've developed a research project and a master's thesis on the challenges and solutions to homelessness in smaller Canadian cities. So this project has been developed in partnership with the Social Planning Council, who I see is here today, who is my community partner. And so for my research, I focused on smaller Canadian cities, and I've used Statistics Canada to define the population size of a smaller city, which I have identified as less than 50,000. So first, I would like to provide a brief background of my research area and then describe my community partnership. So I know John Graham touched on this a bit, but cities across Canada are experiencing an increase in homelessness and are really struggling to keep up with the growing needs in the community. So Canada is experiencing a homelessness crisis as a combined result of the federal government's divestment in affordable and social housing, increased housing and rental prices, cutbacks in full-time and well-paying employment, and reduced investments in mental health supports throughout the country. So these government policy changes and shifts in the economy really shortened the affordable housing supply and reduced rental subsidies and other supports for low-income populations. So in response to the homelessness crisis, the federal government initiated a homelessness strategy called the Reaching Home Program. So this provides 64 selected urban communities across Canada with access to federal funding to address homelessness. However, the communities that continue to be excluded from this program are finding it increasingly challenging to address homelessness without access to federal funding. So Vernon, who I partnered with for my research, is one of many cities that does not have access to federal funding through the Reaching Home program. Vernon has a population of around 43,000, yet 224 people are currently experiencing homelessness within the community. So Vernon is facing significant challenges in addressing the issue of homelessness without access to federal funding. So my co-supervisor, John Corbett, who just presented here, he's a Vernon community member and saw an opportunity to create a community university partnership between the city of Vernon and myself to really research and bring awareness to the challenges that Vernon faces in addressing homelessness without federal support. It was also through John that I became connected with the Social Planning Council, Annette Sharkey, who's actually here today, who has become my key research partner. So it was through Annette that I was able to connect with further community members, particularly those that work directly with the homeless population in Vernon. So some of you, I think I saw some names in the list there. So I recognize some of you might be in these action team meetings, but there's the Partners in Action Committee, the Harm Reduction Team, and the COOL team. So last fall, I started attending these community action meetings, which really helped to develop relationships with the community and to really understand firsthand the challenges that Vernon faces throughout the homelessness crisis. So attending these meetings has been a really important part of my master's program and of my community engaged research. And I wouldn't have been able to develop my research project without the expertise of these community members. So smaller cities have not been given attention within academia and very little representation from the perspective of funding. So I've been able to identify the gaps at both the community and academic level, which I aim to fill through my research. So my research sets out to answer, how do smaller Canadian cities, so with a population of less than 50,000, strategize and adapt to the growing issue of homelessness with limited funding and resources? So my research project was built on the principles and practice of community engaged research. And so my community partner, as I mentioned, Social Planning Council, has been involved in every step of the research process. So this engagement between myself and my community partner is essential to community engaged methodology to ensure that the research really contributes to sustainable social change within the community. Also, in addition to working with Annette, so Social Planning Council, I consulted with other community members throughout my research. So it's really impossible to conduct community engaged research without the expertise of the community, as local knowledge is really essential to my project. So this past summer, I conducted 16 semi-structured interviews with policymakers, stakeholders, and service sector providers in Vernon. So essentially those that work around and with the homeless population. I would like to note that I did not work directly with the homeless population just due to the vulnerability of this group and the limited time frame of my master's program. So these interviews with these community collaborators reveal the challenges and complexities of dealing with homelessness in Vernon, as well as a set of solutions and best practices in addressing homelessness without access to funding and resources from senior levels of government. So I'll get into some of my research findings and highlight some of the initiatives in place in Vernon. So I'll share some of the key challenges of dealing with homelessness that I've identified through my research. So first, the absence of federal funding. So as I mentioned previously, the Reaching Home program has made it really difficult for Vernon to address homelessness and provide the housing and programming needed within the community. So due to this absence of federal support, there's a major lack of affordable and supportive housing for the community's most vulnerable population. Another challenge of being excluded from the Reaching Home program is the limited funding and resources available specifically to the nonprofit sector. So nonprofits are really essential to providing housing and services and programs for those experiencing homelessness, yet are facing difficulties in finding and retaining trained staff to support that population. So this is really due to a lack of funding for training attached to the positions within the service sector. And the last challenge I'll share with you is the lack of awareness and understandings of the causes of homelessness within the community. So the community has witnessed extreme poverty and high profile homelessness expand throughout the city. And this is really due to a lack of funding, services, health resources, and investments from senior level governments. However, some community members may not be aware of the underlying causes of these conditions. And while these community concerns are valid, this calls for education and awareness around the causes of homelessness to understand that this is not an issue of the individual and the failings of the individual, but rather due to a failed and broken system. Although Vernon does not receive this federal support, the city has been very proactive and innovative in its response to homelessness. So here I'll focus on some of the projects and initiatives in place in Vernon as solutions to address and reduce homelessness. So first, the city has created a framework of policy changes to help promote the rental and affordable housing stock. Some examples include the rezoning and legalization of secondary suites in single-family homes and carriage houses throughout the community. So this process of rezoning really helps increase the number of affordable rental units throughout the community. The city has also waived development cost charges for nonprofits looking to build affordable rental units. So in doing so, this lowers the cost charges for nonprofits and demonstrates the city's partnership and investment in these projects. And lastly, another way that Vernon has been successful in addressing homelessness and other social issues is through the various action teams. So I mentioned these earlier, the Partners in Action Committee, the Camp Okanagan Outreach Liaison, also known as the COOL team, and the Harm Reduction team. So these action teams act as coordinating bodies to discuss pressing and contemporary social issues within the community. So they meet on a bi-monthly and quarterly basis to explore the challenges and barriers in the community, really from a solution-oriented perspective. And I've actually had the opportunity to sit in on these action team meetings and have witnessed the community's capacity to really respond to these social issues and meet the needs of the community with limited funding and support from senior level governments. And those are all of my research that I'll share with you for now, but I'll pass it over to Stephanie. I believe she's sharing a video.
Thanks, Bethany. It's always so great to get to hear what you're up to. Kyler, I think you have our quick access to our Creating Allyship and Research video. If you wouldn't mind sharing that, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just test just to make sure that the sound works. So if the panelists, seeing as they're the only ones, please let me know if you can hear it. Can you hear that?
No.
Okay. Let me just see if we can figure a different way to share it. I'll just try sharing it again. We might have to do something. Share sound.
Research aims to chronicle the perspectives and strategies.
That works?
That does,
Perfect.
thank you.
Too loud, too quiet? People can
Perfect,
control it.
carry on.
I
Okay.
think it's perfect.
Steph, do you want to provide some context for the video or?
I do, thank you. Thanks for getting it up there. So as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about some of the addressing homelessness in Kelowna, establishing research priorities work that was completed back in 2019, out of that came a project on allyship and research. We, the individuals I mentioned earlier, Dr. Kelly Myra, Carrie Rempel, and myself, we're working really closely with our co-researchers with lived experience, and those are Dorothy Goodeye and Sherry Landry. And during that process of the initial work in 2019 and working with our co-researchers, we formed this really great understanding of what it meant to be working together, what it meant to be co-researching in a way that was a bit transcended, I think, from community engaged research, where the integration with community populations is so important, but it's not always a requirement to create work from the beginning to the end to incorporate folks with lived experience or incorporate community from every piece of the research project. And that's really what we tried to do with Creating Allyship and Research. So I hope you enjoy this video.
Creating Allyship and Research aims to chronicle the perspectives and strategies from a lens of lived experience of how to genuinely integrate their ideas, perspectives, and voice into the research process.
Allyship to me means that we finally come together as a group, recognizing the problem and discussing how we should address that problem and the action that goes with it. That's what allyship means to me.
Allyship to me is really an ongoing process of engaging people with meaningful voices and with expertise in certain areas, often people that are seen as disenfranchised in the general population.
It's also standing up and being an advocate with no fear to say what that person isn't able to say.
But there's a big difference between including those voices and actually actively engaging them in the process of the design. And I think that's where you shift between including lived experience and allyship, where we're actually actively engaging people in that process of design or creation. And it's a much deeper, more intentional relationship.
So the impact that LECO has on research and the community, I think, is, from our side of the fence, fundamentally humanizing. It's allowing individuals who are attempting to do this type of work to learn to understand the people who are involved, not just the problems.
I was talking to a couple this morning, and they're so used to being talked down to. And this way, this research gave, instead of giving them a hand down, we gave them a hand up.
The integration of allyship and research is absolutely critical to the work that we do. Research is undertaken in partnership and completely co-created from the ground up with people with lived experience voices.
You know, we come in, even the setup of the room, the circle, where we could sit there face to face and talk. And we opened it with the sacred circle, which is very different from other research that I have been in. And this, I believe, had given everybody the comfort and the feeling of safety of speaking out.
One of the first things is to include your allies as an equal partner from the beginning. So that means things like actively going out to them to ensure that the questions that you're asking are the ones that are most important for the group that you're working with and for those core researchers, and ensuring that there's an equality between voices.
Our research is richer, it's more valid, it's more reliable, it's going to be used more, and it is setting the stage for additional research that we wouldn't have been able to do without the involvement of our allies in the research process.
I have the hope and the belief that it's actually going to go somewhere and make a difference.
More inclusion of people with lived experience in research is going to require a demonstration of the value.
This video is intended to be a catalyst to think carefully when designing programs with those from marginalized populations of why inclusion of their perspectives and involvement in project phases is so important.
And I believe that's the whole reason I'm here on Earth, because it's connect those with these and everybody's equal.
We will never conduct research on people of lived experience without their involvement and guidance throughout the entire research process. It takes more time, it takes a commitment, it takes a funding model to do that, but it is integral to any research you do on any needs of the population.
It says nothing about us without us. That lived experience voice brings that to the table. You can't make decisions and solutions that you don't really understand the problem of.
Our deepest gratitude to our co-researchers, Sherry and Dorothy, our community partners, Central Okanagan Journey Home Society and the Lived Experience Circle on Homelessness, and our funders, Enactus Canada and the Vancouver Foundation, for their support of this work.
All right, well, thanks, Stephanie. I think we're segueing to the Q&A portion of tonight's activities. And Chris, you were talking about a Q&A typing process that could occur amongst participants. Is that the way to go, or what's
we've got a couple of options. I'm going to, my job here is to manage the seminar, and there are a couple of things that I can keep an eye on, hopefully at the same time. There's the group chat that some of you have found. That's the least reliable, but you can try that and I might spot a question. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen, if you're not familiar with Zoom, that has things like mute and stop video, but also has Q&A. And if you click on that, you should be able to type a question in the box there, and that'll appear in this webinar feature called the question and answer. That'll stay there until someone decides to see it, and all the panelists can see those questions. So if you have a question, you can put it in there. And finally, you can raise a hand. You've got a raise hand button, and I can see who's got their hands raised, and then I can allow you to speak, and then you can just talk like we were in a room together. So those are all possibilities. We've just had a lot of information thrown at us. So if you need a minute to think, that's totally fine. Take your time. So I think I see a question from Angie Clowry. Can our panelists see that? Who wants to field it?
Angie, the question is, how can the general public get involved to be supportive of this initiative? Well, there's so many things that people can be doing. And I think the faith group pilot that we outlined is an excellent example of people of faith background and other community members being involved in a hands-on way. Anything people can do to change the broader community narrative is very important too. The lived experience people were so emphasizing, and it's most appropriate and correct, the principles of inclusion and community as key, integral to all that we do in homelessness prevention. Do other people have any thoughts, any reflections? And I know there's other experts around, like Michael Shapcott and others.
I think one thing that I would always suggest, John, is a bit self-serving, but for folks to check out our website. There are a variety of different community reports, technical reports, publications, but all of this starts to paint the picture of what's happening in Kelowna specifically, as well as outside of Kelowna as we start to expand the work that we are doing. More specifically is the Allyship and Research Project, where we just saw the video on, that has an accompanying toolkit. So the idea of allyship and research is not just around research principles, but also projects. So if there are projects that are being planned in the community or ideas for projects that different organizations or nonprofits or government or anyone really is thinking of undertaking, it's a really excellent resource to review. So I would always really suggest starting in those areas too.
There's a comment from a participant stating they never thought about how smaller towns are not really equipped to deal with homelessness effectively. And there's a great deal of truth to that. And that's one of the real priorities of our group, is to take a look at smaller urban centers, because so much of the research has been based on Calgary, that's been quite successful, Toronto, Montreal, and other major centers. But there are smaller centers beyond that, of course, and Bethany kind of mentioned in passing the difficulties that Vernon and other cities of that scale have had in achieving federal government funding through the Reaching Home platform that committed several $billions to communities to engage in the homelessness reduction initiative. And so it's really real. Kyler's noting also that there's various ways of volunteering within our broader community too, which is a very good point too.
I think maybe just one thing to notice on the smaller communities is that one of the things that doesn't get noted as often is just how raw numbers can kind of influence how you conceive of these rates of homelessness. So again, if Kelowna has 300 people, but there's only 60 in Merritt, what does that mean in terms of communities' relative capacity to support those individuals? And I think what we've, despite the lack of research, what you can kind of see is that those rates per capita seem to increase in BC once you get under the 20,000 person mark. But again, it can be very challenging to make sense of that in terms of the spread of areas and aspects like that on what that region is meant to support in terms of geography.
And it's amazing when we're talking about homelessness reduction, what can actually be implicated. An example is moving upstream to mental health services for youth. And, Kelowna, among other communities, have increased the scope and intensity of services for young adults and youth in the mental health sector. And making those services accessible is extremely important, because early onset psychosis is a very real risk factor for homelessness. And so the more that we can prevent people from falling into the risks and hazards of homelessness, the better. And there's so many different factors within society that are implicated in all of these things as well. Just reading some of the questions. Federal government funding, a question: how is it that communities might be able to secure federal government housing funding for housing and homelessness prevention generally? And these quite frequently are political issues involving advocacy and lobbying public initiatives to secure funding and to pressure various governmental bodies to fund various scales of communities and communities generally.
And I think one of the things on, just to build on John's point, is the point on that it is various government officials. Again, part of one of the, I'm more, again, familiar with Kelowna, but as Bethany noted in her presentation on Vernon, is that it includes municipal, it includes BC funded supportive housing, it includes federal reaching home for the 64 communities that are eligible. But part of that is just kind of the mix of various levels of government specific to our own federal system. And that part of the funding in terms of helping to provoke interest for those that weren't able to see was the Vote Housing campaign that was run by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and their continued actions. So if you have a specific interest in provoking their interest, I'd say that subscribing to their newsletter, which I'll post in the chat, is a direct answer to that question, as that's their overall goal, is particularly at the federal level, and then local action to local communities.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Kyler. I mean, that $10 billion federal strategy that emerged in 2017, emerged out of the very hard work of advocacy and various people coming together and saying we need to increase federal dollars to end homelessness. I have to say, too, that the Journey Home platform has so much going for it here in Central Okanagan. Journey Home platform, 3 high priorities in the 5-year strategy include reductions in chronic and episodic homelessness, but chronic in particular. 85% of the given homelessness community are episodic. And so people will come in and out of homelessness, people will cycle in and out of homelessness, but quite frequently in many communities, the real resource intensiveness, the really difficult portion of people who are homeless to have stick into a permanently housed situation are those who are chronically homeless. The 5% in particular who've been homeless for a great deal of time over a longer period of time. And this is a really very strong priority of the Journey Home platform. In the Central Okanagan platform to end homelessness is emphasizing those who are chronically homelessness, concentrating likewise on upstream projects. And I mentioned mental health as one of them. And then systems coordination. There's a great deal of siloing among service sectors and child welfare, mental health, substance misuse, and other auspices not talking to one another, and very uncoordinated services that are gradually becoming more coordinated.
So is there a written question that you'd like to field, or I see there's a hand? Something else jumping out at you or another presenter?
Who would like to take a question off of out of our presenter?
All right.
Who'd like to have a question out of the chat group? I've been doing a lot of talking.
Well, let's give Bill the microphone. Bill Dunsmore, you are unmuted. Well, I think, yeah.
Okay, I'm brand new at this, and thank you guys so much for everything you've done. It makes me so proud as an alumnus. I'll get to the point really quickly. What I've seen is sort of a micro representation, albeit very, very important, in terms of homelessness in the Okanagan. Have we considered how we can, provoke or get our federal government into setting up economic standards and screens that will allow for private sector investment in public housing, so that we could provide much more supply? Because it seems to me that we have more of a demand problem and less supply. And at that point, I'll hand it over. Did that work?
Yeah, we heard you, Bill. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that worked wonderfully well. There are various national strategies to create new housing supplies, including some private-public collaborative ventures like you're referring to, Bill. But absolutely, I mean, there's a real problem in available housing stock and available social housing stock in particular. In Finland, for instance, 25% of all housing is mandated to include social housing. And we don't have any sort of proportionality along those lines here in Canada. But they're all ideals that we could head towards most certainly. I mean, there's a variety of initiatives at the federal level rental construction financing, federal lands initiatives, affordable housing innovation funds, among other sorts of things. But, and to its credit, BC Housing has done a very good job in creating an increased number of social housing stock in Kelowna and beyond in the last 5 years, partly in response to the local Journey Home plan, but not exclusively. So there are things being done, but the problems can be so difficult because particularly when we're dealing with people who are chronically homeless, which is a real priority of the homeless reduction strategy in the central Okanagan region, is working with individuals to ensure that they will stay housed and not return to shelters or to other unhoused situations. And these contexts that we're dealing with are quite frequently multimodal. So many different intersecting issues coming together to create the nexus for homelessness in individuals' lives.
I do think, though, John, it's important to consider like the rental stock as well. With the massive, 33% increase in house values over the period of the last 12 months, we're seeing a lot of, of renters, cashing in on their rental properties. So we're going to see an increasing, an increasing sort of strangulation of available rental housing. And I think, it's great to focus on chronic, on chronic homelessness, but I think we also might be sitting on a time bomb of a number of young families and young people essentially not even being able to access rental properties. And I totally agree with you. BC Housing is doing an amazing work, not just in Kelowna, but also in Vernon as well. There are a number of key strategic partnerships underway there.
Yeah, and for context, just from the Kelowna, because the community trends report came out, there was essentially a 30% increase in prices across the board. And in particular in Okanagan, we ended up when they did the living wage assessments with the highest outside of Vancouver, I believe. And I think the increase in the secondary market in Kelowna is now the largest in the country.
So we have a number of questions that are waiting there. Anything else jump out at the research folks?
I think a lot of them, there were a couple that I'd like to kind of address indirectly, perhaps on stigma. And again, I think there are one specifically is in terms of people who are midstream in their homelessness and coming out of their crises. One of the things that would have been featured in the video, but again in what Stephanie mentioned, is the lived experience circle on homelessness. Some of those members that were our co-researchers came from that circle, and that was a kind of formal structural way to provide feedback from a lived experience perspective. But in addition to other structures such as the providing employment opportunities for people with lived experience, which is kind of a subset of that in Kelowna, there's also a lived experience group in Penticton with the addictions angle. I'm not sure if the other co-panels are aware of anything in the Vernon context, but I think overall then leading that back to some of those stigma questions and inviting people to be a part of the conversation. I think there are a variety of anti-stigma campaigns in terms of just promoting understanding. And I know sometimes stigma can be a bit strong of a word, and concurrently going through BC Interior Health, on the addiction side, will simultaneously each communities try to address beliefs and challenge beliefs as they relate to housing. In Kelowna, the city has a structure for community inclusion and kind of promoting those through community advisory committees and kind of engaging that, blending that community and those experiencing homelessness, as after all, they are residents within communities and they are citizens within our towns.
Yeah, really great comments, Tyler. There's an interesting question on human rights and co-associating the right to being housed to a human right. And exactly to the point. Housing is one of these distinctive things. We all need it, and it's a commodity. It's an investment for those who own things. We're sitting on considerable housing stock across the country that remains unoccupied. And it's a really, seems to me to be sociologically unresolved. On the one hand, we're talking about a very real human rights issue. On the other hand, market forces are prevailing that don't always provide, and certainly Canada is the case right now, sufficient housing stock for those who are most vulnerable. What other questions do we have? Who's next?
Well, I do see Michael Shapcott would like to get in. So Michael, I will allow you to talk. Here we go.
Tremendous.
You need to unmute and then we can go ahead.
Is that good? So thank you for this excellent presentation. I'm 3.5 years ago, I moved to Sorrento, not the one in Italy, but the one in the North Okanagan, which is a rural area. And all the issues that you've raised in terms of small urban areas are magnified in terms of the rural areas. We have the housing insecurity and all the forces generating housing insecurity and homelessness, but nowhere on the radar screen are any of the solutions. And efforts at collaboration, of course, require support in terms of the kinds of supports that you've talked about and that are clearly being created in Vernon. And those are much more challenging in rural areas with the distances and the thin network of services. So I wanted, first of all, to thank you for that and to say that we are doing the best we can to let the federal government know that the $40 billion or so they committed to ending homelessness in Canada in 2017, that money needs to reach small urban areas and indeed into the rural communities like Sorrento and the South Shuswap. My question, though, is going to something that John Graham just talked about, which is one of the biggest forces in terms of generating housing insecurity is, of course, the private markets in housing. Within 5 minutes walk of the little cabin that I live in Sorrento, there are any number of brilliant, beautiful, well-built houses that are sitting empty most of the year, and they're vacation homes for people. And I'm not proposing a war on wealthy Albertans, but I am suggesting that a significant part of our population is overhoused, and that a significant part of our population cannot get access to even the most minimal forms of housing. So I wonder what thoughts you have in terms of addressing the issue of the inequity in the private ownership and private rental markets, and how those issues can be addressed in a small urban area and rural areas.
Spot on, Michael. I mean, I don't know, and John Corbett or others, if there's any particular projects that are going on to speak to that specific issue in very tight geographic terms. I mean, it strikes me as a highly political issue, but it's a real issue. John Corbett, do you know of anything? I don't off the top of my head, or Stephanie or anybody.
But, I mean, we could look at Vancouver's done some cool stuff around, taxes on empty property.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's carrots and there's sticks with this. I was thinking though, while you were talking there, Michael, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about the Okanagan is the fact that we are in this sort of liminal space between being both rural, but also being a tourist destination. So for example, if you look at the west side, how many houses there are owned as second properties or anything basically with a view of the lake. And I wonder if that's not, falsely inflating house prices as well, all the way through the Okanagan. But I personally maybe somewhat would be more draconian about this. And there's already been people, been writing in there around forcing developers to lay aside a certain percentage of housing to make it affordable, around taxing empty properties, we also desperately need to be able to, to put out the fire of this, increasing house prices. So, increasing interest rates is probably the best way to be able to achieve that. And I think we're heading to higher interest rates because, of course, but then the problem is I have 2 children now in their early 20s, and I'm concerned because, of course, they will never be able to buy a property if it remains at these high levels with high interest rates associated with mortgages. Then they're never going to be able to buy into the market. Combined then also with the fact that now so many high-tech companies are actually directly in the process of buying up property throughout North America because they see it as a strategic investment. We basically have a retrenchment back into sort of medieval feudalism. I hate to say it, where we're seeing where we're seeing an enclosure, particularly of property and the value associated with it, by property within, ultra rich people. And of course, that just leads to greater inequality. But it's such a critical series of questions within that. But I would like to be more draconian. I'd like to see more government control over these sorts of things, more government involvement.
Yeah. There's a question on what levels of government are involved in the homelessness response, and it's all three. And the reason for that is the British North America Act of 1867, the original name for our Constitution, and other sections 91 and 92 of our Constitution. What was described back in the day as eleemosynary responsibilities, which include what we understand to be, social welfare, including housing, health, and education. Those three areas were devolved to the provincial levels of government, and what was in 1867 terms to be considered the more important areas of external relations, tariffs, trade, those sorts of things remain federal auspices. But the wrinkle in all of this is, and we're one of, I think there's still only 22 federal systems across the world, so it's a federal system with those two levels of government. But going into the mix is the third level of government, the local level of government, where the buck quite literally stops for certain services in the social sector. And the problem in Canada, of course, has been that cities have no constitutional jurisdiction. They're creatures of the provinces. And as you recall from previous eras in Quebec and Ontario, cities can be created or disbanded by provincial writ. And the scope of revenue generation of municipalities is quite frequently restricted to the property tax, which is fixed on a mill rate, which has its own very real problems, and transfers from federal and in particular provincial governments. So in a way, municipalities are closest to the ground, and in terms of homelessness, absolutely, and yet are beholden to these higher levels of government. And one of the reasons why we had, for a kind of 30 to 35 year period, of some semblance of a quasi-universal welfare state from the period 1943 to the mid-1970s, was partly because of the advocacy of municipal levels of government in the 30s that were going broke during the Great Depression, because they were being asked to provide unemployment relief and all sorts of services during the worst possible time from a revenue generation perspective, when upwards of 25% of Canadians were unemployed and values of properties were crashing, and there simply wasn't the revenue mechanisms. So it's a system that we inherited from 1867. It's changed over the decades, and the federal government certainly involves itself in housing. But historically, these sorts of concerns have principally rested with the provinces. But again, because of the long residue of really an Elizabethan poor law tradition, the local levels of government remain extremely important in this country for the provision of a lot of the infrastructure and the support for our social welfare tapestry in terms of direct services.
Well, I would say, and again, to maybe direct back to one of the previous questions of private. I mean, the one thing that I always think of is the CMHA housing in Kelowna that was able to partner with Women Homes for the Bright Minds youth housing and get the 18 micro suites that they had. And I think part of it's also just kind of creative thinking. It's not as applicable to some of the smaller pieces, but one of the Hastings development is going to include safe shelter beds, studio apartments, affordable rentals, new market housing, and a social enterprise space by the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center. And I think that's kind of one of the best examples of how you provide that mix that some of our colleagues also talk to, and also addressing some of those aspects of colonization. There's also the Kamloops development, providing housing for both seniors and youth so that they can have mentorship and cultural things, so cultural opportunities in that context. So I think a lot of it has to do with both people, again, wanting to push government. There was the comment in the chat about whether or not affordable housing is 25% below. Affordable housing in BC is actually just below median. So 50% of the housing is affordable through that definition. Whereas again, federally, there's the push to keep it to 30% of the income. And that's goes to show how you can say you're building affordable housing, but it comes down to the average person to read what that means, what they want to see, and work collaboratively across levels of government and voters and funders and private enterprises on what they can do to contribute to this issue in a way that maybe provides for a socially oriented capitalism, to address that other comment that the person made.
Some great questions and comments about the disproportionate presence of people of Indigenous backgrounds in the homelessness sector. And a comment, I struggle with the commodification of unceded traditional territory and the high percentage of Indigenous unhomed. I'd love to hear your thoughts on coming to a meaningful resolution, perhaps by directed home transfer taxes. I mean, very innovative point. There's a lot here to these things. I don't know if others have any reactions or comments to these thoughtful remarks.
I wanted to also pick up on one of Michael Shapcott's comments there about, thanks for your response to questions about inequity in the private housing markets. And it got me thinking, would you consider that there will be the potential for maybe public housing? Is this something that we would see, like a return to some sort of estate type housing that would be, put up and maintained by government? Is that something that the North American market could handle?
That's directed to Michael Shapcott.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm just going to find him here and allow him to talk. There you go. Go ahead, Michael. Unmute.
Well, some of you know that from 73 to 93, that the national housing strategy that generated 600,000 plus homes were all in the social sector. They were nonprofit housing, community-based housing, municipal housing, and nonprofit co-op housing. And but Canada lags behind some countries that have a significantly larger portion of its housing stock in the nonprofit sector. I certainly think that a return to that kind of housing program is very much needed. What we're finding now across Canada is that the funding that's on offer from the federal government is not really allowing for the construction of a robust not-for-profit housing sector. But there are all sorts of models, co-housing and so on, just sort of developing out all the different models of non-market housing that could really be part of it. And I think as long as housing, this is my personal opinion, as long as housing continues to be a commodity and a private investment, then we're going to see the market forces will try to take advantage of that, and that's what markets do. They try and maximize the return for wealthy investors in markets. So, but Canada's history is one of great success from 73 to 93 in terms of the national housing program, and sometimes going back to the future is a good idea, and looking to BC Housing, for instance, which I think is amongst provincial housing agencies quite progressive. They are willing to consider the funding the social sector. So I would certainly commend that. Here in the South Shuswap, our first two projects that we're working on are both nonprofit, non-market projects. One's a seniors project, and the other's a co-op.
Okay, thanks, Michael. We're getting close to the end of our time, so I'm going to give the mic to Jane Wakefield to ask her question. And I think that'll be the last one for the evening. Jane, you need to unmute and then you can ask a question.
I'm unmuted.
You are, go ahead.
Okay, my comment, it's a comment rather than a question. In all of the work I do with this, in both the Shwemek territory and the Selects territory, because I live and work in both, is that the more the housing becomes less available to people who need it, what I see is that whole communities are getting to the point where they're sometimes having such crises within the communities because they now have people moving into some of them with with monies that come from crime, of course. And it's really difficult for a lot of people if they thought they were in a nice, safe area and bang, it's not so safe. And it's not safe for their children. And so we've got to do something with the housing. That's a huge issue.
Okay, thanks, Jane.
Comment.
Chris, before we wrap up, I want to thank everybody for their participation. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions. The questions were extremely good, every one of them. Please do log into the Corona Homelessness Research Collaborative website, KHRC, and subscribe to our mailing list. We want to stay in touch with each of you, and we'd love to work together with all of you in order to make a very significant dent in reducing homelessness in our region.
I can jump in, Chris, just with one thank you. One final jump off from John is that we actually have an email address, ask.khrc@ubc.ca. Kyler, if you could throw that into the chat, or maybe you'll.
He's way ahead of you.
Awesome, because as John said, we've had some really great questions that we didn't get to. So we do invite you to continue the conversation with us, whether that be through our mailing list and subscribing to our newsletter, checking out our website, our social medias, or sending us an email. We're happy to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Let's keep the conversation going. It's been great. We really appreciate everybody's participation today.
Yeah, and thank you to all of our panelists. You bring so much to this table. It's a bit like drinking from a fire hose tonight. So my head's going to spin for a while, and that's excellent. I am, with your permission, going to upload this to YouTube. I was a little slow on the record button, so I cut myself off, and I cut John Graham's initial comments off a little bit at the beginning, but the rest of it will be available for future viewing. If anybody has a problem with something they said and they don't want it on YouTube for any reason, just let me know and I will edit it out. So I'm going to give you 24 hours to make that decision, because I won't put it up on YouTube right away. So just get in touch with me if you want anything removed. I'm going to save the chat. I'm going to save the questions. I'll try to find a way to put it into the video description or something equally accessible online. And my only final comment, except for thanking everybody, is that our next speaker series is February 22nd. Our next topic is going to be addiction specifically, and our presenter is going to be someone who is on the front lines of doing individual addictions counseling. So it's going to be from a clinical perspective, not a research perspective. So I continue to be excited about this series. Lots of food for thought and lots of food for hope. I forgot to mention that another guiding principle for me is we have a lot of crises and a lot of complexities in our society right now, but one of the things that I'm really noticing is despair over climate, despair over social change, progress, making our society and our world better. And so I'm really glad for tonight's presenters for focusing on things that are hopeful and actually developing, even as we acknowledge the challenges that remain. So thank you to all our presenters. Thank you everyone for showing up. And I look forward to checking in with all of you again at our next speaker series. God bless and good night.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris, for doing this.
Great stuff, everybody.
Thank you.